She had always done her best for her family. She helped with money, supported them, and silently accepted humiliation. But on her foster mother's birthday, she was made to realize that she didn't belong here. No one expected her sister's new boyfriend to say something that shocked everyone. Please subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The morning sun crept through the tall windows of Aaliyah's apartment, casting soft golden stripes across the polished hardwood floors. She stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a large mug of black coffee, staring out at the sprawling cityscape of Chicago. To any casual observer, she was a picture of success, poised, graceful, commanding. CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the Midwest, she had built her empire brick by brick, code by code, deal by deal. Yet, beyond the glinting towers and accolades, there existed a silent hollowness, an ache she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Aaliyah was not born into privilege. She was adopted as an infant into a white family who lived in a clean, respectable suburb just outside the city. They were the sort of people who believed in charity as a concept but had never truly considered the soul of the person they brought into their home. To them, she had been a project, a symbol of generosity, a badge of progressive honor they could wear proudly among their friends. But a project was all she ever remained. Growing up, Aaliyah had been the quiet presence in family photographs, standing stiffly beside her adoptive parents and their biological daughter Madison. Madison, with her golden hair and bright blue eyes, was the embodiment of their aspirations, poised, charming, effortlessly radiant. Every school recital, every family gathering, every church potluck, Madison was the centerpiece, the sun around which the family orbited. Aaliyah, dark-skinned and serious-eyed, was the satellite on the periphery, always orbiting, never quite belonging. It wasn't that they were overtly cruel. Their words were always couched in politeness, their smiles tight but present. Yet the coldness seeped into every interaction. Praise for Madison was effusive and endless. For her beauty, her ballet recitals, her perfect report cards, her succession of respectable boyfriends. For Aaliyah, there was only the occasional pat on the back, the reluctant acknowledgement of a good grade or a sports award, quickly overshadowed by a discussion about Madison's latest triumph. From a young age, Aaliyah understood that if she wanted to earn even a fraction of what Madison received effortlessly, she would have to work twice as hard, achieve twice as much, and expect half as much gratitude. She devoured books, excelled in math and science, won scholarships that none of her peers thought possible. Still, at family dinners, the conversations swirled around Madison, her prom dress, her college acceptance letters, her summer internships. Aaliyah learned to smile and nod, learned to swallow the lump in her throat, learned to hope that maybe next time they would see her too. One Christmas, when Aaliyah was 15, she received a scholarship to a prestigious STEM camp at MIT. She ran home, the acceptance letter clutched in her hand, her heart pounding with excitement. Madison was lounging on the living room couch, idly flipping through a fashion magazine. Their mother was in the kitchen, humming a Christmas carol as she basted a turkey. "Mom, Mom, look!" Aaliyah exclaimed, thrusting the letter toward her. Her mother glanced at it briefly, then smiled politely. "That's nice, dear," she said, before immediately turning to Madison. "Maddie, did you decide on the color for your winter formal dress? We need to order it soon." The moment was gone. Aaliyah stood frozen, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, the sound of Madison's laughter echoing like a slap. That was the moment she realized. No achievement, no accolade would ever be enough. As the years passed, Aaliyah's resolve hardened. She attended Northwestern on a full scholarship, majoring in computer engineering, graduating summa cum laude while juggling internships, part-time jobs, and research grants. She and 2 classmates founded a startup in her senior year, an ambitious venture into AI healthcare solutions. The first few years were grueling. Late nights, ramen dinners, endless pitches to skeptical investors. But slowly, steadily, Pacific Innovations grew. By the time Aaliyah was 31, she was CEO of a company valued at over $300 million, overseeing a team of 200 employees, courted by investors from New York to Silicon Valley. She had built something monumental, something real. Yet, in her family's eyes, it was as if she worked at a nameless desk job, hidden behind spreadsheets and meaningless jargon. They never asked about her work, never congratulated her on her milestones. When they spoke of careers at all, it was to laud Madison's part-time event planning business, treating it as a glittering success. On holidays, the pattern was always the same. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, relatives flocked around Madison like moths to a flame, admiring her dresses, gushing over her boyfriends, marveling at her social media followers. Aaliyah would sit quietly in a corner, making polite conversation with whichever elderly relative happened to be left unattended. "She's doing something with computers, right?" they would say, their voices dripping with vague disinterest. "Yes," another would reply, already turning back to Madison. "But did you hear about Madison's engagement? He's a lawyer." It was always like that. Aaliyah was not a daughter, not a sister, not a person. She was a footnote. And yet, despite everything, despite the 1,000 small wounds that never fully healed, Aaliyah continued to show up. She attended the birthdays, the holidays, the christenings, and the anniversaries. She brought thoughtful gifts, offered to help clean up, paid attention to the details no one else bothered with. Deep down, a fragile hope remained. A hope that if she stayed long enough, tried hard enough, achieved enough, they would finally see her. Finally love her. That hope was what had kept her sending money home, month after month, year after year. The house was aging, the repairs mounting. Madison's financial troubles after a failed business venture had put a strain on their parents' savings. Without being asked, Aaliyah had quietly picked up the slack, paying for plumbing repairs, covering utility bills, even paying for her mother's new medication when insurance wouldn't. They never thanked her, not once. Instead, they spoke of Madison's tough luck and how everyone was struggling. They praised Madison for hanging in there and congratulated her for keeping her spirits up. Aaliyah remained invisible, her contributions absorbed into the background like wallpaper. Standing now in her immaculate kitchen, Aaliyah thought about all of it. The birthdays where she had been ignored, the Christmas mornings where her gifts were barely glanced at, the phone calls about broken appliances and unpaid bills where the only words she heard were, "Can you send something over?" She sipped her coffee, feeling the bitterness of it coat her tongue, the warmth of it doing little to chase away the cold inside her. Outside the window, the city thrummed with life, indifferent and constant. Somewhere out there, her team was preparing for a new product launch. Investors were waiting for her green light. The world was full of people who respected her, admired her, even envied her. But not them. Not the people who were supposed to be her family. Aaliyah set her mug down on the counter with a soft clink and crossed the living room to her desk. She sat down in the sleek, ergonomic chair, the city lights twinkling behind her like distant galaxies. She opened her laptop, fingers poised above the keyboard, hesitating. She wasn't sure what she was searching for. A sign, maybe. A reason to keep trying. Her inbox was full of meeting requests and congratulations from her colleagues. No emails from her family, no check-ins, no casual hellos, no acknowledgement of her existence. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence stretch. When she opened them, she knew. It wasn't enough to be good. It wasn't enough to be successful. Some people would never see past their own narrow lenses, no matter how brightly you shone. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop waiting for them to. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The city hummed on. And in the quiet of her apartment, Aaliyah made a silent vow, not to prove herself to them anymore, but to live for herself. Not because they had finally seen her, but because she had finally seen herself. The days leading up to her mother's birthday passed in a haze of meetings, reports, and quiet, efficient work. Aaliyah barely noticed the spring rains that swept through the city, turning the streets into mirrors of gray and silver. She answered her emails, approved marketing budgets, and finalized a strategic partnership with a medical research firm in Boston. Her life moved forward, orderly and calm, even as an unspoken weight settled deeper in her chest with each passing hour. She had already booked her flight back home, a red-eye ticket allowing her to land early enough to help with preparations like she did every year. In past birthdays, she would bake her mother's favorite lemon cake from scratch, help string lights across the porch, arrange the seating chart for dinner. She knew the routine by heart, the frantic cleaning, the frantic cooking, the frantic smiling when distant relatives arrived to heap praise on Madison and pointedly ignore Aaliyah's presence. This year, despite everything, she had planned to show up again, a part of her, still clinging to the last threads of duty, of hope, wanted to believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe a new boyfriend for Madison would mean a fresh start, a chance to show that Aaliyah had grown into someone worthy of being acknowledged. Maybe, even after everything, they would let her in. It was a Thursday evening when the phone rang. Aaliyah was sitting at her desk reviewing a patent application from the legal department when the familiar ringtone buzzed through her apartment. She glanced at the screen. "Mom." The sight made her heart lift and sink simultaneously, a reflex she couldn't quite control. She answered on the second ring, forcing a lightness into her voice. "Hi, Mom." Her mother's tone was warm but cautious, like a hostess trying to manage a guest list gone awry. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, talk of the weather, of old neighbors moving out, of the new tulips blooming in the backyard. And then her mother's voice shifted, growing tighter at the edges. "So, honey," she began, dragging the words out as if tasting their bitterness, "about the party this weekend." Aaliyah's stomach tightened, a subtle warning she had learned to heed long ago. "We're all really looking forward to it," her mother said, her words curving like a polite dagger. "And Madison's bringing someone special. His name's Alex. He's wonderful, just wonderful. Works for a very prestigious company, very well connected." There was a pause. Aaliyah stayed silent, letting the words unspool. "The thing is," her mother continued, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "with everything going on, we just thought maybe it would be better if this year you didn't worry about making the trip." The words hit with the softness of a hammer. Aaliyah felt her throat close slightly, her grip tightening around her pen. She forced herself to stay calm. "I've already booked the flight, Mom. I'm taking time off work." Another pause. Longer this time. She could almost hear her mother pressing her fingers against her forehead, searching for the right excuse. "It's just," her mother said finally. Alex comes from a very refined background. His family's particular. We don't want to make things complicated. First impressions matter, you know. Aaliyah sat very still. You mean, she said, her voice low and steady, you don't want me there because I might complicate the image you're trying to present. Her mother hesitated, then gave a brittle little laugh. No, it's not that, sweetheart. It's easier for everyone this way. Less pressure. You understand, don't you? There it was, the familiar refrain. You understand, don't you? Of course she understood. She always had. I see, Aaliyah said quietly. Maybe we can do something just the two of us later, her mother rushed to add. A nice brunch or a weekend getaway, just us girls. Wouldn't that be nice? Aaliyah said she had to go. She hung up before she could hear any more empty promises. She sat back in her chair, staring at the muted skyline outside her window, the city pulsing in shades of blue and silver. She felt no tears prick her eyes, no tremble in her hands, just a vast, bottomless quiet. For a long moment, she simply breathed, letting the silence stretch until it became almost comforting. Then she rose, crossed the living room, and retrieved her laptop. She logged into her banking app, her fingers moving with mechanical precision. She navigated to the section labeled Automatic Payments. There, in neat rows, were the bills she had been quietly paying for years. Electricity, water, internet, security systems, the insurance premiums for her parents' aging house, even the supplemental health coverage for her mother's prescriptions. Month after month, year after year, she had funded their comforts in the background, asking for nothing, expecting little, not even a thank you. She hovered the mouse over the cancel button. For the briefest second, she hesitated, not out of guilt, but out of sheer muscle memory, the reflex to protect, to serve, to fix. The reflex they had trained into her so thoroughly she barely noticed it anymore. And then she clicked. One by one, the payments disappeared. Electricity, canceled. Water, canceled. Internet, canceled. Insurance, canceled. No alarms sounded. No messages flashed. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like the closing of an old, worn book. Aaliyah sat back, the laptop humming softly on the table, and exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't anger that filled her. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity. They hadn't asked her to stay away because she was too busy or because they were worried about her workload. They had asked her to stay away because she didn't fit the image they wanted to project. Because her presence, her very existence, was inconvenient. And for the first time in her life, she realized she didn't have to keep showing up where she wasn't wanted. The flight remained booked, the bags remained packed, but Aaliyah knew she would not be getting on that plane. Instead, she would stay here, in her own life, in her own home, among the people who valued her for who she was, not for what she could provide or how well she could disappear. The night deepened. The city lights flickered and gleamed. Aaliyah poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the world spin on without her family's approval. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting. She was choosing, and that made all the difference. The morning of her mother's birthday dawned gray and sluggish, the sky over Chicago a low, heavy sheet of clouds that dulled the city's usual sparkle. Aaliyah woke early, as if her body still clung to old habits, expecting the hustle and urgency of a travel day. But instead of rushing to pack last-minute gifts or scrambling for a taxi to the airport, she moved slowly through her apartment, savoring the rare and unfamiliar luxury of time. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich aroma curling through the quiet rooms. Outside, the streets gleamed wetly from an overnight rain, the city still shaking itself awake. Aaliyah settled into the armchair by her window, her legs curled beneath her, the warm mug cradled between her palms. It felt strange to be here, at home, instead of boarding a plane, instead of rehearsing polite smiles and steeling herself for the inevitable chill of her family's reception. For a long time, she simply sat there, letting the minutes stretch and tangle like lazy vines. She watched as the sky shifted from deep slate to a muted, misty silver, the day unfolding without demand or expectation. The absence of obligation, of the frantic need to prove herself, was disorienting but not unwelcome. Around 9:30, her phone buzzed for the first time. Aaliyah glanced at the screen, unsurprised to see her father's name flashing there. She didn't answer. She simply watched as the call rang itself out and faded into silence. A few minutes later, the first message appeared. No power in the house. Call the provider. Guests coming soon. She set the phone face down on the table and sipped her coffee. Outside, the city pulsed and churned, indifferent to her family's minor disasters. Another buzz. No water either. What's going on? Still, Aaliyah made no move to respond. She knew exactly what was going on. She had canceled every auto payment weeks ago. She had freed herself from their silent, relentless demands. Another message. Internet's down. Can't reach anyone. You need to fix this. It was almost impressive, she thought, how seamlessly they had reverted to their old ways, issuing commands without so much as a please, expecting her to shoulder their burdens without acknowledgement or gratitude, as if her only value to them had ever been in her ability to solve their problems. She stood, stretching the stiffness from her limbs, and crossed to the kitchen. She poured herself another cup of coffee, moving slowly, deliberately. Outside, the rain began to fall again in soft, whispering sheets. Her phone continued to buzz at regular intervals, messages from her mother, frantic and pleading, messages from Madison, curt and increasingly irate. Aaliyah skimmed each one without responding, feeling nothing but a deep, serene detachment. This was not cruelty. This was not vengeance. This was survival. By noon, the volume of messages had reached a near constant stream. Complaints about the lack of electricity, anger over the inability to prepare food, panic over the guests arriving to a dark, cold, chaotic house. She could picture the scene vividly. Her mother wringing her hands in the dim kitchen, her father barking orders, Madison fluttering around in panic, trying to salvage the perfect image she had so carefully constructed. The relatives murmuring among themselves, casting curious glances at the mounting dysfunction. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair and smiled faintly, not in satisfaction, but in quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had always been there, hidden beneath the polite smiles and brittle compliments. She was not their scapegoat anymore, not their silent fix-it girl, not their invisible safety net. She was free. At 2:00, a new message arrived, different from the others. It was from Madison. Seriously, Aaliyah, Mom's about to have a breakdown. The guests are noticing. We need you to do something. This is Mom's birthday, for God's sake. Aaliyah read the message twice, noting the utter absence of apology or self-awareness. It was astonishing, really, how even in desperation they managed to make it about her obligations rather than their failures. She set the phone aside and rose to fetch a throw blanket from the couch. She wrapped it around her shoulders and returned to her window seat, watching as the rain softened the edges of the city, blurring glass and steel into watercolor smudges. The minutes passed, the hours. She made herself a light lunch, answered a few work emails, took a call from her CFO about an upcoming presentation. The world outside her family's frantic little bubble moved on, indifferent and alive. Around 5 in the evening, as the city's lights flickered on and the rain slowed to a misty drizzle, her phone buzzed again. A video call. Aunt Sharon. For a moment, Aaliyah hesitated. Aunt Sharon was the only member of the family who had ever made an effort to reach out, however sporadically. Holiday cards, the occasional text on birthdays, nothing profound, but enough to mark her as different. Aaliyah answered. The screen lit up with the dim, shaky image of Aunt Sharon's kitchen. The room was illuminated only by the bluish glow of a flashlight, casting long ghostly shadows on the walls. Sharon's face appeared, tired and drawn, her hair pulled back hastily. "Hey, honey," she said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but your mom's in a real panic. The house is a mess. No power, no water. Guests are uncomfortable. She keeps saying she doesn't know what went wrong." Aaliyah stayed silent, her expression calm. Sharon hesitated, then added, her voice lowering, "She also keeps saying that you must have forgotten something, that maybe you were too busy with work." A deep, tired sadness settled in Aaliyah's chest. Even now, even after everything, they couldn't imagine that she had made a choice, that she had drawn a line. She met her aunt's gaze through the screen, steady and unflinching. "I didn't forget," Aaliyah said quietly. "I canceled the payments." Sharon blinked, startled. "My dad told me," Aaliyah continued, her voice as steady as the rain outside, "that it would be better if I didn't come, that my presence would complicate things. So I listened. I stepped back. I honored their wishes." The silence on the other end of the call stretched thin and taut. "I understand," Sharon said finally, her voice rough with something like regret. "I'm sorry, Aaliyah. You didn't deserve that." Aaliyah offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Tell them," she said, "that I hope the rest of the evening goes well." She ended the call before Sharon could respond. Setting the phone down on the table, Aaliyah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The apartment was warm and still around her, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the soft tapping of rain against the glass. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a vast, steady peace. She had not lashed out. She had not sought revenge. She had simply chosen herself at last. And for the first time in her life, that choice felt like enough. The night deepened, the sky fading from gray to black. Lights twinkled across the city like scattered constellations. Somewhere far away, her family was scrambling to salvage their image, their celebration, their version of the truth. But Aaliyah was here, alone and whole, her heart unburdened by the weight of their expectations. The rain finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining. Aaliyah rose, turned off the living room lights, and stood by the window, watching the city breathe beneath the clearing sky. She had walked away from the hollow promises, the transactional love, the endless cycle of duty and erasure. She had chosen herself. And in the quiet hush of the rainy night, that choice rang louder than any applause. Evening draped itself over the city like a velvet curtain, soft and impenetrable. Aaliyah sat quietly in her apartment, the empty mug of tea resting on the small side table beside her, watching the last traces of gray dissolve into inky blackness. Across town, in the well-manicured streets of her childhood suburb, the birthday party she had been uninvited to was undoubtedly unraveling. She imagined the flickering candles, the nervous smiles, the whispered apologies as the guests milled awkwardly through the darkened house, and she felt neither triumph nor regret. Only a stillness deeper than anything she had ever known. Her phone lay silent on the table. No new messages, no missed calls. It was as if the connection between her and that world had finally, mercifully been severed. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her eyes tracing the blurred outlines of distant traffic. Somewhere between one slow breath and the next, her mind drifted back to the conversation with Aunt Sharon, to the brief flash of genuine remorse in her aunt's tired eyes. It had been a small thing, a moment barely lasting seconds, but it had pierced through the numbness Aaliyah had worn like armor. It was strange, she thought, how easy it had been to step away once she allowed herself to. All those years she had believed she was bound to them by love, by duty, by blood. Yet now, sitting alone in her apartment with the hum of the city cradling her, she realized the only chains had been the ones she placed on herself. The buzz of her phone shattered the quiet. Aaliyah turned her head slowly, her heart oddly calm. She reached for the device and glanced at the screen. It was another video call, but this time not from Aunt Sharon. The name flashing there made her eyebrows lift slightly. Madison. For a long moment, Aaliyah simply watched the screen, letting it vibrate against the tabletop. Finally, curiosity, or perhaps the lingering sense of obligation she had not yet fully excised, nudged her to accept. The screen blinked and then filled with the chaotic image of the house she had once called home. It was chaos. People milled around in the background, their faces tense and strained. The room was dimly lit by scattered candles and the occasional harsh glare of someone's phone flashlight. The table was half set, a cake sitting lopsided among a sea of untouched dishes. Her mother fluttered around like a trapped bird, her face pinched with distress. Her father stood stiffly near the fireplace, his jaw tight. And there, in the center of it all, stood Madison, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Aaliyah," Madison hissed, dragging her into a private corner of the frame. "What the hell is going on?" Aaliyah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Madison pressed on, her voice low and urgent. "The power's out. The water's out. The internet's down. People are leaving. Mom's about to cry. Alex is here, and he's starting to ask questions." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, studying her sister's face. Even now, Madison's primary concern was not their parents' comfort, not the guests' disappointment, but the image she had so painstakingly curated. "He's going to think we're trash," Madison hissed. "We have to fix this." Aaliyah remained silent, her expression unreadable. Madison shook the phone slightly, her frustration boiling over. "Why are you just sitting there? This is Mom's birthday." Before Aaliyah could respond, another figure appeared behind Madison. Alex. He stepped into view, tall, composed, his eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. He glanced at Madison, then at the phone, and then leaned slightly closer, peering at the screen. Recognition flickered across his face. "Aaliyah?" he said, his voice cutting through the background noise like a bell. Madison stiffened. "You know her?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Alex straightened, his expression shifting into something Aaliyah had seen many times in boardrooms and negotiation rooms: respect. "She's my boss," Alex said simply. The room seemed to freeze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even Aaliyah's mother, still clutching a serving spoon, gaped openly. "My boss," Alex repeated, louder this time, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "Aaliyah is the CEO of Pacific Innovations, the company I just transferred to." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, All Aaliyah could hear was the faint static crackle of the poor connection and the distant rush of rain against her own windows. Madison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Her father's face flushed a deep, angry red. Her mother looked as if she might actually drop the platter she was holding. Aunt Sharon appeared briefly in the background, her expression unreadable. Aaliyah allowed herself a small private moment of stillness, of closure. She had not shouted. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply lived her truth, and now the truth spoke for itself. "I hope the rest of the evening goes well," Aaliyah said quietly, and with that she ended the call. The screen went black, leaving her apartment bathed once again in soft, forgiving shadows. She set the phone down carefully, almost tenderly, as if laying to rest a heavy burden she had carried for too long. The rain outside had stopped, and a tentative light was beginning to creep back into the sky. Somewhere, far below, a car horn blared, and the city resumed its endless, indifferent rhythm. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She had not sought this moment. She had not orchestrated it. But now that it was here, she welcomed it with open arms. The false narratives, the casual cruelties, the polite erasures, they had all crumbled in a single, unplanned instant. And she had not needed to lift a finger. The truth had done all the work for her. She thought about Alex's face, the clear respect in his voice when he had named her, the stunned expressions of the relatives who had spent years looking through her as if she were invisible. She thought about the quiet dignity with which she had handled herself, the boundaries she had set and defended, and she realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she had finally stepped out of the shadows, not because they had invited her into the light, but because she had built her own. The evening stretched long and still around her. No more calls came, no more messages buzzed. The silence was profound, but for once it was not lonely. It was peace. Aaliyah rose from her chair and moved through her apartment, turning off the lights, locking the doors. She brushed her teeth, changed into soft, comfortable clothes, and slid beneath the cool sheets of her bed. Outside, the city breathed and pulsed, alive and vibrant. Inside, Aaliyah closed her eyes and let herself drift, not into sleep, but into something deeper, a freedom so complete it bordered on sacred. The chains had been broken, the masks had fallen, and for the first time in her life, Aaliyah was not waiting for permission to be whole. She already was. Morning seeped into the apartment slowly, pale and hesitant, casting muted gold across the minimalist decor. Aaliyah woke before her alarm, the remnants of deep, dreamless sleep still heavy on her limbs. She stretched languidly, savoring the rare sensation of true rest. No tightness in her chest, no gnawing anticipation of confrontation, only calm, vast and unfamiliar, stretching out ahead of her like a quiet road. The events of the previous evening settled in her mind with surprising clarity. There had been no triumph, no exhilaration in the revelation that had cracked the fragile veneer of her family's illusions. Only an even, unwavering certainty. The truth had surfaced on its own, indifferent to the timing, oblivious to the chaos it left in its wake. And Aaliyah, for once, had simply let it happen. She rose, padded barefoot into the kitchen, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. As the rich aroma filled the room, her phone buzzed insistently from the counter. She glanced at it, unsurprised to see Madison's name lighting up the screen again. This time, she ignored the call entirely. She poured herself a cup, sat by the window, and let the city's slow, methodical awakening wash over her. The texts began almost immediately after the missed call. First came the predictable accusations. You knew exactly what you were doing. You ruined everything last night. Mom cried herself to sleep because of you." Each message was a sharp, frantic lash, desperate to provoke a reaction. Aaliyah read them all with detached curiosity, as if they were case studies in a psychology textbook. The words didn't pierce her. They couldn't. Not anymore. She sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her as the sun edged higher into the sky. By mid-morning, the tone of the messages shifted, from anger to pleading. "Can't you at least call Mom? She doesn't understand why you did this. Please, just help fix it." Aaliyah leaned her head against the window pane, watching a pigeon hop along the ledge outside. Even now, even after their rejection had been laid bare, they saw her only as the fixer, the solution, the silent labor behind the scenes. Never the person, never the daughter. The irony was almost too sharp to laugh at. Her phone buzzed again, a long string of new messages piling up. One caught her eye. From Madison. "Alex won't even talk to me. He's humiliated. He said he saw everything he needed to see last night." A second message quickly followed. "Please, you have influence. You're his boss. Can't you just tell him it wasn't that bad? Can't you help me fix this?" Aaliyah sat very still, feeling something shift inside her, a slow, seismic realignment of old boundaries. Once, not so long ago, she would have jumped at the chance to mediate, to smooth things over, to preserve the fragile, conditional relationships she had spent so much of her life nurturing. Once, she would have sacrificed her own peace to salvage theirs, but not anymore. She rose, placed her coffee cup in the sink, and returned to her desk. Her laptop hummed to life beneath her fingertips. She opened her email, methodically working through the morning's correspondence, letting the mundane normalcy of spreadsheets and project updates anchor her. When she finally turned her attention back to her phone, it was only to type a brief, unsent message. "Loyalty isn't owed to those who only remember you when they need something." She read the words twice, then deleted them without sending. There was no need. Some lessons had to be learned without explanation. The day unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of routine. Meetings, budget reviews, strategic calls with partners. Alex's name came up once during a financial report. He had submitted a thorough, thoughtful analysis of a recent investment opportunity, impressing the senior team. Aaliyah acknowledged his work with professional detachment, noting only that his proposal would be reviewed in full at the next leadership meeting. She neither mentioned nor dwelled on the chaos of the previous evening. In the world she had built for herself, one of respect, merit, and boundaries, personal dramas held no sway. By evening, the sky had shifted into soft indigo, the city's lights blinking awake one by one. Aaliyah closed her laptop, gathered her things, and stepped out into the crisp spring air. She walked the familiar route to a nearby cafe, her steps unhurried, her mind clear. She chose a seat by the window, ordered a latte, and watched as the world spun quietly on without her family's constant noise tugging at the edges of her peace. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message from Madison. This one longer, more desperate. "You don't understand, Aaliyah. I need him. I love him. I know I made mistakes, but everyone deserves a second chance. Please, just this once, help me. Tell him you forgive us. Tell him we're good people." Aaliyah read the words, feeling only a muted sadness. She had spent her entire life trying to be seen by people who looked right through her. She had bent herself into impossible shapes, made herself small, made herself useful, made herself invisible, all in the hope that someday, somehow, they would finally recognize her worth. And now, when the facade had cracked and crumbled, when the consequences of their choices had come crashing down, they wanted her to fix it. Not because they loved her, but because they needed her. She set the phone aside and stared out the window, watching the steady flow of traffic, the scatter of pedestrians navigating the sidewalks with umbrellas and briefcases and tired, determined steps. She thought about loyalty, about love, about the difference between family by blood and family by choice. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent to keep the peace. And she knew, with a certainty deeper than bone, that she owed them nothing. Not her silence. Not her loyalty. Not her forgiveness. When she returned home, the apartment was dark and quiet, the familiar comforting stillness wrapping around her like a balm. She turned on a single lamp, made herself a simple dinner, and curled up on the couch with a book she had been meaning to read for months. The messages continued to come. She ignored them all. At some point, late into the night, her phone buzzed with a new name. Alex. She hesitated, then opened the message. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. I see it now. All of it. Thank you for your professionalism, for your dignity. I respect you more than you know." Aaliyah smiled softly, a smile tinged not with triumph, but with release. She typed a simple reply. "Thank you for seeing." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she closed her phone without feeling the familiar pull of guilt, of obligation, of invisible debts owed. She was free. Not because they had freed her, but because she had freed herself. The city murmured and breathed around her, a living, endless tapestry of lives unfolding. And Aaliyah, at last, had chosen her own. The week that followed unfolded with a strange and heavy stillness, as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath in the aftermath of a long-delayed reckoning. For the first time in her life, Aaliyah moved through her days without the invisible weight of familial obligation pressing against her ribs. She woke early, exercised, drank her coffee while reading industry news, and arrived at the office with a sharp clarity that seemed to startle even her most seasoned colleagues. No new messages came from Madison, none from her parents. It was as if, after exhausting every tactic, anger, guilt, pleading, they had retreated into a stunned, sulking silence. Aaliyah did not miss the noise. In fact, she welcomed the quiet with open arms. At work, the aftermath of the revelation still rippled subtly through the office corridors. Alex, to his credit, maintained a professional demeanor. Their interactions were crisp, courteous, and focused, never once dipping into the personal or the awkward. He had proven himself to be competent, respectful, and deeply aware of the boundaries she had set. Aaliyah appreciated it more than she could say. It was during one particularly long afternoon, as she reviewed the updated quarterly projections, that her phone buzzed against the desk. She glanced at the screen and felt a flicker of old, familiar weariness. Mom. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But some part of her, the part that still wanted to confront things head-on, not out of anger, but out of the need to finally close the door properly, pressed accept. Her mother's voice was soft, almost timid, a far cry from the sharp, commanding tones Aaliyah remembered from childhood. "Hi, honey," her mother said, the words faltering. "Hello, Mom," Aaliyah replied, her tone neutral. There was a long, awkward pause. "We've been thinking," her mother began, choosing each word as if navigating a minefield. "About everything, about what happened." Aaliyah said nothing, allowing the silence to press gently against her mother's need to fill it. "We realize," Maybe we weren't as fair to you as we should have been, her mother continued. Maybe we overlooked things. Still, Aaliyah stayed silent, her heart steady. And we thought, her mother said, her voice brightening slightly, sliding into the rehearsed tone Aaliyah knew too well. Maybe, now that you're so established, so successful, it might be a good time to help out a little, just until things settle down. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, letting the ceiling lights blur in her vision. She could practically hear the paper unfolding over the line, the rehearsed pitch, the practiced entreaty. We were thinking, her mother pressed on, a small monthly contribution. Nothing much for someone like you. $2,000 a month just to cover basics, utilities, insurance, some savings for retirement. The brazenness of it almost made Aaliyah laugh. After everything, after being told she wasn't good enough to be seen beside them, after being cast aside for the sake of a polished image, they still saw her only as a resource. Madison's been going through a rough patch, her mother added hastily. After the breakup, after everything. We can't ask her for much right now. Aaliyah's chest tightened, but not with the familiar sting of hurt. No, this time it was something cleaner, sharper, a severing. And in return? Aaliyah asked, her voice as smooth and cold as glass. Her mother hesitated, caught off guard. I assume, Aaliyah continued, this isn't just charity. You want something. Well, her mother said, her voice softening into that infuriating, cajoling lilt, we thought, if you help now, when the time comes, everything would go to you. The house, the savings, all of it. Fair's fair, right? The offer was insulting in its transparency, as if dangling an inheritance, after decades of neglect, would somehow erase the years of erasure, the small cutting humiliations, the cumulative weight of being treated as a second-class presence in her own family. Aaliyah sat forward, resting her elbows on the desk. If Madison agrees, she said calmly, to contribute her share, $1,000 a month, then I'll consider it. She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. And, Aaliyah added, her voice never wavering, it must be in writing. A contract signed and notarized that upon your passing all assets go solely to me. No ambiguity, no disputes. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When her mother spoke again, her voice was tight with outrage. How can you even suggest something like that? After everything we did for you, we raised you, fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay us? Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, centering herself against the onslaught of guilt, so familiar it almost felt nostalgic. You raised me, she said evenly, and in return, I gave you everything I could, my loyalty, my silence, my money, for years. Without thanks, without acknowledgement, because I believed that's what family meant. But it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. Her mother sputtered something, an accusation, a protest, but Aaliyah cut her off gently, almost kindly. I'm not your safety net, she said, and I'm not your scapegoat. If you want help, you meet me where I am, on equal terms, not as a debt to be collected, as a choice. Her mother's voice broke then, a soft, wounded noise that might have once moved Aaliyah to tears. Not anymore. We'll think about it, her mother said stiffly, and then the call ended. Aaliyah set the phone down, her hands steady, her heart strangely light. The dam had broken, the old patterns shattered beyond repair. She rose, gathered her things, and left the office, stepping out into the crisp air of a city slipping into evening. The streets were alive with motion, cars honking, pedestrians rushing by, the golden glow of shop windows spilling onto the sidewalks. Life surged around her, chaotic and beautiful, and utterly unconcerned with her family's drama. She walked without purpose, letting her feet guide her through the city's winding arteries until she found herself outside a small, familiar cafe. She stepped inside, ordered a latte, and settled into a corner booth by the window. As she sipped her coffee, she pulled out her phone and, without hesitation, blocked Madison's number. Then her mother's. Then her father's. The silence that followed was pure. Aaliyah leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the rain begin again, soft and silver in the gathering dusk. She thought about the years she had spent contorting herself into smaller and smaller spaces, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant to hold her. She thought about the countless apologies she had whispered for simply existing. No more. If they could not see her value unless it came with a price tag, then they had never seen her at all. She would no longer set herself on fire to keep them warm. Outside, the city lights blurred and shimmered in the rain, a living testament to resilience. And inside, Aaliyah sat quietly, feeling, for the first time, truly, irrevocably free. The days that followed passed with a stillness so profound it felt almost surreal. No messages came, no calls, no desperate apologies or attempts at manipulation. It was as if a great storm had blown through, leaving only silence in its wake. Aaliyah moved through her routines with a quiet steadiness, savoring the absence of invisible weights pressing down on her shoulders. At work, the atmosphere was crisp and efficient. Meetings proceeded smoothly, projects advanced according to plan, and if any of her colleagues suspected the magnitude of what had unfolded in her private life, they kept their observations to themselves. Alex continued to perform well, maintaining a respectful professional distance that Aaliyah deeply appreciated. Whatever feelings lingered from the collapse of his relationship with Madison, he kept them firmly outside the office doors. In that, at least, there was dignity. Aaliyah embraced the rhythm of her days. She reclaimed the hours she had once spent anxiously scanning her phone, awaiting some word of validation or acknowledgement. She filled her evenings with long walks through the city, reading novels she had long neglected, exploring new cafes tucked into the folds of Chicago's vibrant neighborhoods. It was not an extravagant life, but it was hers, wholly and entirely, and for the first time in years she felt herself inhabiting it fully. One bright Saturday afternoon, as the city buzzed with the first true promise of spring, Aaliyah found herself wandering into a small bookstore near Lincoln Park. The scent of old paper and coffee hung in the air, and the narrow aisles beckoned like secret passageways. She drifted through the shelves, running her fingers along the spines, feeling no particular urgency, no need to be anywhere else. It was there, nestled between volumes of poetry and memoirs, that she saw the small wooden sign. It was carved simply, almost crudely, the letters uneven but earnest. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a choice. Aaliyah stood there for a long moment, the words sinking into her like seeds into rich soil. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to build a home within the walls of people who had never truly welcomed her. She thought about the countless times she had twisted herself into impossible shapes, dimmed her light, silenced her voice, all in the desperate hope that they would one day open the door and say, "You belong." But belonging, she realized now, was not something to be begged for. It was something to be claimed. Home was not the house where she had grown up, with its well-kept lawn and sterile, smiling photos lining the hallway. It was not the forced smiles around holiday tables, the whispered criticisms dressed up as concern. It was not the endless race to earn a love that had always been conditional. Home was the life she had built with her own hands, brick by careful brick. It was the friends who celebrated her victories without resentment, who offered comfort without obligation. It was the colleagues who respected her mind and her leadership without questioning her right to occupy the space she had claimed. It was the quiet mornings with coffee and city views, the evenings spent wrapped in solitude or laughter, depending on her choosing. Home was herself. She purchased the sign, tucking it carefully into her bag, and stepped back into the sunlight, feeling its warmth spread through her in slow, golden waves. A week later, a letter arrived. It was a formal, stiffly worded missive from a lawyer representing her parents. No apology, no acknowledgement of past hurts, just a curt notification that they would not be pursuing her offer. No contract, no formal arrangement. They would manage on their own. Aaliyah read the letter once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She felt no anger, no sadness, only a deep, resonant confirmation of what she had already known. They would rather struggle alone than accept her on her terms. And that was their choice, just as walking away had been hers. Spring unfurled itself across the city in slow, triumphant bursts. Trees bloomed with stubborn optimism, cafes spilled onto sidewalks, and the lake shimmered under an increasingly generous sun. Aaliyah leaned into the season's renewal, letting it soak into her bones, washing away the last clinging traces of old grief. She no longer marked the days by missed calls or unreturned messages. She no longer scrolled mindlessly through old photos, searching for glimpses of a connection that had never truly existed. She no longer wondered what she could have done differently, better, more. She had done enough. She was enough. One evening, as she closed her laptop after a long but satisfying day, Aaliyah received a message from Alex. It was short, direct, and respectful. "Thank you for your leadership. I've learned more in these few months than I ever expected. I hope someday to build something as strong as you have." She smiled at the message, appreciating the sincerity without feeling the old compulsion to overextend herself in response. She typed a simple reply. "You will. Keep your focus, stay true to your values, the rest will follow." And that was all. No entanglement, no blurring of lines, just the quiet satisfaction of having earned respect on her own terms. Later that night, Aaliyah sat on her balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The city sprawled before her, alive and endless, full of stories she had yet to write. She thought about Madison, about her parents, about the hollow rituals and empty gestures that had once defined her sense of family. She wished them peace truly. She hoped they found whatever it was they were seeking. But she no longer carried the burden of their acceptance like a stone in her chest. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had built a life far richer, far fuller than anything they had ever offered. The wooden sign now hung above her desk, its message a quiet beacon. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a choice. She had made her choice. And as the breeze ruffled her hair and the city's heartbeat thrummed steadily in her ears, Aaliyah closed her eyes and smiled. The world stretched wide before her, full of possibility. And she was finally, irrevocably, gloriously free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Check out other videos we have. There's always something worth watching. And if you think someone else would appreciate this story, feel free to share it.